The wind howled through the pines like a wounded beast, carrying with it the promise of another brutal storm. Samuel Hawkins pulled his buffalo coat tighter around his shoulders and squinted through the swirling snow. His horse, a sturdy mountain mustang named Buck, picked its way carefully down the treacherous slope, ice crackling beneath its hooves. For 12 years, Samuel had made these mountains his home. The jagged peaks of the Colorado Rockies rose around him like ancient sentinels, their snow-capped summits lost in the gray fury of the approaching blizzard. At 32, he'd spent more than a third of his life in this wilderness, trading the complexities of civilization for the harsh simplicities of survival. His hands, scarred and weathered from years of setting traps and skinning game, gripped the reins with practiced ease. The leather saddlebags behind him bulged with beaver pelts and wolf hides, a month's worth of trapping that would fetch enough salt, ammunition, and flour to see him through the worst of winter. If he could make it to Pine Ridge before the storm hit full force. The town appeared through the snow like a mirage, a cluster of rough-hewn buildings huddled against the mountainside, smoke rising from chimneys to be instantly torn away by the wind. Samuel hadn't planned to stop here. Pine Ridge wasn't his usual trading post. That was Clear Creek, another day's ride north. But Buck was favoring his left front leg, and the storm was closing in fast. He guided his horse down the main street, past the general store with its frost-etched windows, past the saloon where yellow lamplight spilled onto the wooden sidewalk. The town seemed unusually quiet for late afternoon. Then he heard it, the distant sound of fiddle music carried on the wind. The small church at the end of the street blazed with light. Horses and wagons crowded around it, their owners apparently unconcerned about the approaching storm. Samuel frowned. A wedding, from the look of it. In weather like this, folks must be either very much in love or very much in a hurry. He dismounted outside the livery stable, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The stable boy, a freckled youth of perhaps 14, emerged rubbing his hands together. "Afternoon, mister. That's quite a storm brewing." "That it is," Samuel replied, his voice rough from disuse. Days could pass in the mountains without him speaking a word to anyone but Buck. "My horse needs tending. Left front hoof might have a stone." The boy nodded, eyeing Samuel's wild appearance, the tangled beard, the wolfskin cap, the rifle slung across his back. Mountain men were a rare sight these days, even in Pine Ridge. "Wedding at the church," the boy offered as he took Buck's reins. "Mr. Morrison's marrying that woman from back east. Pretty as a picture, they say." Samuel grunted noncommittally. He had no interest in town gossip or society weddings. His concern was the storm and finding shelter for the night. The Frontier Inn stood across from the church, and he headed there, his moccasined feet silent on the boardwalk despite his large frame. The inn's common room was nearly empty. Most of the town was at the wedding, it seemed. Samuel approached the desk where a thin man with spectacles sat reading a newspaper. "Need a room for the night?" Samuel said, setting a silver dollar on the counter. The clerk looked up, adjusting his spectacles. "Certainly, sir, though you might have trouble sleeping with all the celebration. The whole town's at the church. Mr. Morrison's quite the prominent citizen." Samuel took the offered key without comment. He had no intention of joining any celebration. A hot meal, a warm bed, and he'd be gone at first light, storm or no storm. But as he turned to head upstairs, the church doors burst open, music and laughter spilled out into the snowy evening, and the wedding party began to emerge. Samuel paused despite himself, watching from the inn's window. The groom came first, a heavy-set man in his 40s wearing a black suit that strained across his broad shoulders. His face was florid, whether from cold or drink. Samuel couldn't tell. He had the look of a man used to getting his way, with small, calculating eyes and thick hands that gripped his new bride's arm possessively. Then Samuel saw her. She emerged from the church like a vision in white, her simple cotton dress a stark contrast to the rough frontier setting. Unlike the elaborate gowns he remembered from his youth in Missouri, hers was plain but elegant, suited to a frontier wedding. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a modest veil, and when she lifted her face to look at the swirling snow, Samuel's heart stopped. Even from across the street, even through the veil and the gathering dusk, he could see her features clearly. The delicate curve of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders, the particular tilt of her head when something caught her attention, all achingly familiar. She turned, perhaps sensing his gaze, and looked directly at the inn window where he stood. Her eyes widened, and her lips parted in surprise. Time seemed to stop, the celebrating crowd fading away until only the two of them existed in that frozen moment. Then she moved. Despite her new husband's firm grip on her arm, despite the crowd pressing around them, she pulled free and walked straight toward the inn. Her white dress dragged in the snow, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes never left Samuel's face. He found himself moving too, drawn by something stronger than reason. He pushed through the inn door and stood on the threshold as she approached. Up close, he could see how beautiful she'd become. Not the pretty child he remembered, but a woman of perhaps 25, with an elegance that seemed out of place in this rough mining town. She stopped just before him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that clung to her despite the cold wind. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear above the wind. "Do you recognize me? Mountain Man? I was your childhood neighbor." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Elizabeth, Libby Turner, who'd lived on the farm next to his family's back in Missouri. Libby, who'd helped him catch fireflies in mason jars and wade in the creek looking for arrowheads. Libby, whose family had vanished one terrible night when their barn burned, taking her father with it. "Libby?" His voice came out hoarse, uncertain. She smiled then, a sad, sweet expression that nearly broke his heart. "No one's called me that in years. It's Elizabeth now. Elizabeth Morrison, as of about 10 minutes ago." Behind her, the wedding crowd had noticed her absence. The groom, Morrison, was pushing through the guests, his face darkening with anger. "You left," Samuel said stupidly, unable to form more coherent thoughts. "After the fire, you all just left. We had to. Mother couldn't bear to stay, and Uncle Theodore offered us a home in Philadelphia." She glanced over her shoulder at her approaching husband. "I always wondered what became of you, Samuel. When I heard about a mountain man trading in the territory, something made me hope." "Elizabeth!" Morrison's voice boomed across the street. "What in blazes are you doing?" She flinched but didn't turn. Instead, she reached out and touched Samuel's hand where it rested on the doorframe. Her fingers were ice cold. "I'm glad I got to see you again," she whispered. "I'm glad to know you're alive." Then Morrison was there, grabbing her arm roughly, pulling her back. "You'll excuse my wife," he said to Samuel, though his tone suggested no apology. "She's overtired from the celebrations." Samuel's instincts screamed at him to intervene, to pull her away from this man whose grip left white marks on her skin. But he knew the rules of civilization, even in a frontier town. She was married now. She belonged to another. "My apologies," Elizabeth said formally, allowing herself to be led away. But her eyes remained on Samuel's face, and in them he read something that made his chest tight. A plea, perhaps, or a farewell, or simply the echo of what might have been. The wedding party moved on, heading toward Morrison's grand house at the edge of town. Samuel stood in the doorway until they disappeared into the swirling snow, his mind reeling. Libby Turner, here of all places, married to that brute Morrison. He went back inside and climbed the stairs to his room, but he knew sleep would be impossible. Outside, the storm struck with full fury, rattling the windows and howling through the gaps in the walls. But Samuel barely noticed. All he could think about was a summer evening 20 years ago, when a boy and a girl had sat by a creek and promised to be friends forever. The memory hurt worse than any wound the wilderness had ever given him. Samuel sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his head in his hands. The lamp flickered in the drafty room, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls Elizabeth. After all these years, Elizabeth Turner stood before him in a wedding dress, married to another man. The memories came flooding back with a force that left him breathless. He was 12 again, racing barefoot through the tall grass with Libby at his heels, her laughter ringing across the Missouri fields. They'd been inseparable that last summer, building forts in the hayloft, catching tadpoles in the pond, sharing dreams under the vast prairie sky. He remembered the day she'd fallen from the apple tree, scraping her knee badly. He'd carried her piggyback all the way home, her arms tight around his neck, her tears dampening his shirt. His mother had cleaned the wound while Libby squeezed his hand, and afterward they'd sat on the porch eating ginger snaps, watching the fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. "When I grow up," she'd said, "I'm going to marry someone brave like you, Samuel." He'd laughed, embarrassed. "That's silly talk, Libby." "It's not silly. You'll see." But they never got the chance to grow up together. 2 weeks later, the Turner barn caught fire in the middle of the night. Samuel had woken to the orange glow on his bedroom wall and the sound of his father shouting. By the time they reached the Turner farm, the barn was an inferno. Mr. Turner had run in to save the horses and never came out. The next morning, Mrs. Turner and her children were gone. A hastily scrawled note explained they'd gone to live with relatives back east. No forwarding address, no goodbye, just an empty farmhouse and the blackened ruins of a barn. Samuel stood and paced the small room, unable to shake the image of Elizabeth's face as Morrison grabbed her arm. There had been fear in her eyes. He was sure of it. Not just surprise at seeing him, but genuine fear of her new husband. He knew Morrison by reputation. Though they'd never met, James Morrison owned the largest freight company in the territory, with contracts to supply the mining camps scattered through the mountains. He was known as a hard businessman who crushed competitors without mercy. There were darker rumors, too, stories of missing freight drivers who'd crossed him, of claim jumpers found dead on land Morrison wanted. Why would Elizabeth marry such a man? The girl he'd known had been gentle and kind, always rescuing wounded birds and befriending stray cats. She'd cried for a week when her favorite lamb was slaughtered for Easter dinner. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Samuel opened it to find the stable boy from earlier, now covered in snow. "Sorry to bother you, mister, but your horse is settled in fine. Found a stone wedged in his shoe, just like you thought. He should be good by morning." Samuel handed the boy a coin. "You were at the wedding?" The boy nodded eagerly. "Everyone was. 'Cept those who had to work. Quite a to-do. Mr. Morrison brought in food from Denver and everything. The bride, she from around here?" "No, sir. Came in on the stage about 2 months back. From Philadelphia. They say she and her mother were staying at Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house." The boy's face grew serious. "Her mother took sick and died just last week. Lung fever." "Guess that's why the wedding was so quick, mister. Morrison offered to take care of everything." Samuel's heart sank. So Elizabeth was alone, recently orphaned, probably penniless. Morrison had swooped in like a vulture, offering security in exchange for what? A beautiful young wife to show off? A genteel Eastern woman to give him respectability? Did Miss Turner seem happy about the marriage? The boy shifted uncomfortably. "Well, she's a lady, ain't she? They don't show their feelings much, but—" He glanced around as if Morrison might be listening. "My ma says it's a shame. Such a sweet young thing married to a man like that. Ma does washing for the Morrison house, and she says he's got a terrible temper when he drinks." After the boy left, Samuel couldn't stay still. He pulled on his coat and headed downstairs. The storm had worsened, but he needed air, needed to move. The saloon across the street beckoned with warmth and light. Inside, the wedding celebration had spilled over from the church. Men lined the bar, toasting Morrison's good fortune with raised glasses. Samuel found a corner table and ordered whiskey, keeping his hat low over his eyes. "To Morrison," someone shouted. "May his new bride give him strong sons. And may she survive the process," another man added with a crude laugh. "His first wife didn't last 2 winters." Samuel's hand tightened on his glass. Morrison had been married before. Two men at the next table were deep in conversation, their voices carrying despite the noise. "Pretty little thing," one said. "Seems refined, not like the usual women out here." That's what Morrison wanted. His companion replied, "Someone to give him class. He's got political ambitions. Wants to run for territorial governor when we get statehood." "Well, she'll look good on his arm at campaign events, if she lasts that long." "What do you mean?" The man lowered his voice, but Samuel's wilderness-trained ears caught every word. "You didn't hear about his first wife, Margaret, her name was, took a tumble down the stairs one night. Broke her neck. Morrison was playing cards at the saloon when it happened. Plenty of witnesses to say he wasn't home. Accidents happen. Sure they do. Funny thing, though, the doc said she had bruises that didn't match the fall. Old ones, mostly. Morrison paid for a real nice funeral, and nobody asked questions." Samuel drained his whiskey and left, unable to bear any more. Outside, the wind hit him like a physical assault, driving snow into his face. He stood in the street, looking toward the Morrison house where lights gleamed in the windows. Somewhere in there, Elizabeth was beginning her wedding night with a man who might have killed his first wife. The thought tormented him as he made his way back to the inn. In his room, he tried to reason with himself. It wasn't his business. She'd made her choice. He had no claim on her, no right to interfere. They'd been children together. Nothing more. That was 20 years ago. People changed, but he couldn't forget the touch of her cold fingers on his hand, the plea in her eyes. She'd recognized him immediately, even through his wild appearance, and she'd risked her new husband's anger to speak to him. Why, unless she needed help? He thought of his life in the mountains, the solitude he'd chosen after too many disappointments in civilization. He'd fled Missouri after his parents died, unable to bear the memories. He'd tried his hand at various trades, working as a guide, a scout, even a sheriff's deputy for a time, but always he felt the pull of the wilderness, the need to be alone with his thoughts and the vast silence of the peaks. Now that carefully constructed solitude felt like cowardice. He'd run from connections, from caring, from the risk of loss. And here was Elizabeth, the last link to his childhood, trapped in a marriage that already showed signs of danger. Thunder crashed overhead, unusual for a winter storm. Samuel moved to the window and watched the snow fall, thick and heavy. By morning, the passes would be blocked. Anyone wanting to leave Pine Ridge would be stuck for days, maybe weeks, including Elizabeth. He made his decision then, standing at that frost-covered window. He wouldn't leave in the morning as planned. He'd stay, watch, and wait. If Elizabeth needed help, he'd be here. He owed her that much for the friendship they'd shared, for the promises children make and adults forget, for the girl who'd believed he was brave. A movement in the street below caught his eye. A figure in white moved through the snow. Elizabeth, still in her wedding dress, a dark shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She walked quickly, head down against the wind, heading back toward the church. Samuel grabbed his coat and followed, keeping to the shadows. She slipped into the church through a side door. He waited a moment, then entered after her. She knelt in the front pew, her shoulders shaking, in the dim light of the altar candles. He could see she was crying. "Elizabeth?" She spun around, startled, then relaxed when she saw him. "Samuel, I needed a moment of peace." He approached slowly, as he would a frightened deer. Up close, he could see her face was already showing signs of strain. Her careful hair arrangement had come partially undone, and there was a red mark on her wrist where Morrison had gripped her. "Are you hurt?" She laughed bitterly. "Not yet. He's drinking with his business associates. I said I felt faint and needed air." She looked up at him, and the desperation in her eyes made his chest tight. "Oh, Samuel, what have I done?" He sat beside her, careful to maintain a proper distance. "The stable boy said your mother passed." "I'm sorry. She was all I had left. When she died, I had nothing. No money, no family, nowhere to go. Mr. Morrison was..." kind. At first, he paid for Mother's funeral, settled our debts at the boarding house. He said he'd been looking for a wife, someone with education and refinement. He made it sound like a business arrangement that would benefit us both. And now, she touched the mark on her wrist unconsciously. Now I realize what I've traded for security. She turned to him suddenly. Do you ever think about that last summer, before the fire? Every day, he admitted before he could stop himself. I thought I'd never see you again. When we left that night, Mother was half mad with grief. Uncle Theodore met us in Independence and took us east. I wanted to write, but Mother forbade it. She wanted to forget everything about Missouri. I tried to find you, Samuel said quietly. Rode to Independence that winter. Asked around. No one knew where you'd gone. We changed our name, she whispered. Mother was afraid. There were debts. You see, Father had borrowed heavily to improve the farm. After he died, the creditors would have taken everything. So we became the Carters instead of the Turners. They sat in silence for a moment, the wind howling outside the church walls. Finally, Elizabeth stood. I should go back. He'll be looking for me soon. Samuel caught her hand as she passed. If you need help, anything at all, I'll be at the inn. She squeezed his fingers briefly. You always were trying to rescue things, Samuel Hawkins, but this isn't a baby bird with a broken wing. This is my life now. I made my choice. Did you, or did circumstances choose for you? She had no answer for that. She pulled her hand free and walked toward the door, then paused. How long will you stay in town? As long as necessary. She nodded once and disappeared into the storm. Samuel remained in the church for a long time, staring at the cross above the altar, wondering if God heard the prayers of men who'd lived too long in the wilderness to remember the proper words. The morning after the wedding dawned clear and bitter cold. Samuel stood at his window watching the town slowly come to life, smoke rising from chimneys into the crystalline air. The storm had passed, leaving Pine Ridge buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. The mountain passes would be treacherous, but passable for a man who knew them well. He should leave. Every instinct honed by years of survival told him to pack his gear, retrieve Buck from the stable, and head back to his solitary cabin before he became entangled in troubles not his own. But he remained at the window, watching the Morrison house at the edge of town, its windows dark in the early morning light. The innkeeper, a garrulous man named Josiah Pritchard, was serving breakfast when Samuel came downstairs. Morning, Mr. Hawkins. Coffee's hot and fresh. Samuel nodded his thanks and took a seat near the window. He'd given his real name when registering, seeing no point in deception. Quite a storm last night, Pritchard continued, pouring thick black coffee into a chipped mug. Though not as fierce as the one in Morrison's house, I'd wager. Samuel looked up sharply. What do you mean? Pritchard glanced around the empty dining room and leaned closer. Mrs. Dobbs. She does the cleaning up there. Came by early this morning for supplies. Said there was quite a commotion last night. Shouting, things breaking. The new Mrs. Morrison locked herself in her room. On her wedding night. That's what has tongues wagging. Morrison was pounding on the door, demanding she come out. Woke the whole household. Pritchard shook his head. Not a good start to a marriage, if you ask me. Samuel gripped his coffee mug tightly. Is Mrs. Morrison all right? Far as anyone knows, Mrs. Dobbs said she heard her crying, but the door stayed locked all night. Morrison finally gave up around dawn. Went to his freight office. Pritchard studied Samuel with shrewd eyes. You know the lady? We were neighbors as children, Samuel said carefully. Back in Missouri. Well, she's made her bed, as they say. Morrison's not a man to cross, and a wife's got no legal standing against her husband. Best to stay out of it. But Samuel couldn't stay out of it. After breakfast, he walked through town, ostensibly checking on Buck and purchasing supplies. In reality, he was gathering information, using the skills that had made him a good scout years before. At the general store, he learned that Morrison's freight business was struggling. The arrival of the railroad in neighboring towns had cut into his profits, and he'd borrowed heavily to maintain his monopoly. That's why he wanted a society wife, the clerk confided. Plans to cozy up to the railroad men, maybe get some contracts. A refined woman from back east opens doors that money alone can't. At the blacksmith shop, Samuel heard darker stories. Morrison's first wife, Margaret, had been a local girl, pretty but meek. She'd rarely been seen in town during her 2-year marriage, and when she did appear, she often wore veils or kept her head down. Night she died, the blacksmith said, hammering a horseshoe with unnecessary force. I was working late, heard the commotion, saw Morrison come running from his house, claiming she'd fallen. But here's the thing. He was fully dressed, middle of the night, and his boots were clean. You telling me he heard his wife fall, got completely dressed, but didn't track any snow or mud rushing to help her? By noon, Samuel had pieced together a portrait of James Morrison that made his blood run cold. A man driven by ambition and greed, who saw people as possessions to be used and discarded. A man who'd possibly murdered his first wife when she became inconvenient. And now, Elizabeth was trapped in his house. Samuel was heading back to the inn when he saw her. She walked quickly down the boardwalk, a market basket on her arm, her face hidden by a deep bonnet. But he knew her walk, the way she held herself despite everything. He followed at a distance until she entered the millinery shop. Through the window, he watched her speak with the proprietress, Mrs. Hartley. Even from outside, he could see her hands shaking as she examined ribbons and lace. When she emerged, he was waiting. Mrs. Morrison. He tipped his hat formally, aware of the people passing by. She startled, then composed herself. Mr. Hawkins, good day. Up close, he could see the signs of a sleepless night, dark circles under her eyes, a paleness to her skin that spoke of exhaustion and fear. But there was something else, too, a bruise on her cheek that she'd tried to cover with powder. Would you walk with me a moment? He asked quietly. In full view of everyone. Perfectly proper. She hesitated, then nodded. They strolled down Main Street, maintaining a careful distance between them. To observers, they might have been any two acquaintances discussing the weather. He didn't mean to, she said suddenly. He'd been drinking, the brandy his associates brought. He has very particular ideas about a wife's duties. When I disagreed, he became upset. Samuel's jaw clenched. He struck you. Just once. He apologized this morning, sent flowers to my room, white roses. She laughed bitterly, as if flowers could erase what I saw in his eyes. What did you see? Rage, pure, cold rage, that I had defied him. Oh, Samuel, I've made such a terrible mistake. But there's no undoing it. The law says I belong to him now, like his horses or his freight wagons. They reached the end of the boardwalk where the town gave way to forest. Elizabeth stopped, gazing at the wilderness beyond. Sometimes I think about just walking into those woods and disappearing. She whispered, You wouldn't last a day, Samuel said bluntly. Not in winter, not without proper gear and knowledge. I know, that's the cruelest irony, isn't it? Even if I had the courage to run, I lack the skills to survive. She turned to him. But you don't. You've made a life out there, free from all this? It's not freedom, Samuel said. It's hiding. I see that now. She studied his face. You've changed so much. The boy I knew was gentler. The wilderness changes a man, makes him harder, more practical. But seeing you again? He stopped, aware he was saying too much. I should go, Elizabeth said. He likes dinner promptly at 6, and I need to ensure the cook prepares his favorite meal. Perhaps if I'm very good, very obedient, he'll be kind. You don't believe that. No, she admitted. But what choice do I have? That evening, Samuel sat in the saloon, nursing a whiskey and listening to the talk around him. Morrison held court at a corner table, regaling his associates with plans for expansion once the railroad came through. My wife has connections in Philadelphia, he boasted. Banking families, politicians. Once they see what we're building here, The investments will pour in. Your wife feeling better? One man asked with a knowing smirk. Heard she was indisposed last night. Morrison's face darkened. Women from the East are delicate. She needs time to adjust to frontier life, but she'll learn her place soon enough. The men laughed, and Samuel's hand tightened on his glass. He understood now why Elizabeth had sought sanctuary in the church, why she'd looked at the wilderness with such longing. She was trapped between a brutal husband and a society that saw her as property. But understanding and acting were different things. What could he do? Challenge Morrison to a duel? That would only end with one of them dead and Elizabeth no better off. Take her away by force? They'd be hunted as criminals, and the law would be on Morrison's side. He was so deep in thought that he almost missed the commotion outside. Shouts, running feet, the sound of horses. Morrison and his men rushed out, and Samuel followed. A freight wagon sat in the middle of the street. Its driver slumped over the reins. Blood stained the wooden seat and dripped onto the snow below. "It's Patterson," someone shouted. "He's been shot." Morrison pushed through the crowd. "Get him to the doctor. You two, check the wagon." But Samuel had already seen what the wagon carried, or rather, didn't carry. The freight boxes had been broken open, their contents gone. This was supposed to be Morrison's big shipment, the one that would salvage his finances. "Apache," someone suggested, but Samuel shook his head. The wounds were from bullets, not arrows, and Apache didn't usually leave their victims alive. Patterson survived long enough to gasp out a story. Masked men, waiting at Devil's Canyon. They'd known exactly which wagon to hit, exactly what it carried. Morrison's rage was terrible to behold. He stormed through town, accusing competitors, threatening investigations. But Samuel noticed something interesting. None of Morrison's own men seemed surprised. It was almost as if they'd expected something like this. Late that night, unable to sleep, Samuel walked the perimeter of town. His moccasins made no sound in the snow as he circled the Morrison house. A light burned in an upstairs window. Elizabeth's room, he guessed. As he watched, a shadow passed before the curtains, then another, larger, aggressive in its movements. He heard raised voices. Elizabeth's pleading, Morrison's angry, then a crash, like furniture overturning. Samuel was moving before he could think, but the front door was locked, the windows shuttered. He stood in the snow, fists clenched, listening to the sounds of struggle above. Then silence. The light went out. Samuel waited, every muscle tense, ready to break down the door if he heard Elizabeth scream. But no sound came from the darkened house. Finally, as dawn approached, he returned to the inn, his mind racing. Something had to be done. Elizabeth couldn't endure this life, and Morrison was escalating. The loss of his shipment would make him desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. As he entered his room, Samuel made a decision. He couldn't challenge Morrison directly, but perhaps there was another way. The missing freight, the inside knowledge the robbers had possessed. There was more to this story. And if Morrison was involved in something illegal, if proof could be found. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than watching Elizabeth slowly destroyed by a man who saw her as nothing more than a possession to be used and discarded. Samuel sat at the small table and began to write, documenting everything he had learned, everything he'd seen. Somewhere in the web of Morrison's dealings was a thread that, when pulled, might unravel everything. He had to try. For the girl who'd believed he was brave, and for the man he wanted to be, not hiding in the wilderness, but standing for something worth fighting for. The sun rose over Pine Ridge, painting the snow-covered mountains gold, and Samuel Hawkins, mountain man and exile, began his transformation into something else entirely, a man with a purpose. 3 days after the wedding, the bruises on Elizabeth's face had darkened to purple and yellow, impossible to hide despite her best efforts with powder and high-collared dresses. The town pretended not to notice, but Samuel saw the pitying looks, heard the whispered conversations that stopped when she passed. He'd taken to frequenting the general store each morning, timing his visits to coincide with hers. It was the only place they could exchange a few words without arousing suspicion. This morning, she moved stiffly, favoring her left side. Mrs. Morrison. He greeted her formally as she examined bolts of fabric. Mr. Hawkins. Her voice was steady, but he caught the slight tremor in her hands. How are you finding Pine Ridge? Colder than I remembered, he said, meaning more than just the weather. Some storms seemed to worsen with each passing day. Her eyes met his briefly, understanding passing between them. Yes, the winter here can be brutal. Mrs. Peabody, the store owner's wife, bustled over. That green silk would look lovely on you. Mrs. Morrison, bring out your eyes. Thank you, but I think something more practical, Elizabeth said quietly. The heavy wool, perhaps. As Mrs. Peabody went to fetch the fabric, Elizabeth lowered her voice. He's worse since the robbery, drinking more. Last night. She stopped, unable to continue. I'm working on something, Samuel said urgently. Hold on a little longer. I don't know how much longer I can. Elizabeth! Morrison's voice boomed from the doorway. Both of them turned to see him standing there, his face flushed despite the morning cold. What a pleasant surprise to find you here. He crossed to them in 3 strides, placing a possessive hand on Elizabeth's waist. She flinched almost imperceptibly. Mr. Hawkins, isn't it? The mountain man. Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. Still in town, I see. Storm damaged some of my gear. Samuel lied smoothly, waiting for repairs. Morrison's grip on Elizabeth tightened. Well, don't let us keep you. My wife and I have shopping to do. It was a clear dismissal. Samuel tipped his hat and left, but not before catching Elizabeth's desperate glance. Outside, he stood in the shadow of the building, thinking furiously. Morrison was growing suspicious, and a suspicious man was a dangerous one. That afternoon, Samuel put his plan into action. He sought out Tom Brennan, a former cavalry scout who now worked odd jobs around town. They'd shared a drink 2 nights before, and Samuel had sensed a fundamental honesty in the man. Tom, Samuel said, finding him at the livery stable. I need information about Morrison's freight routes. Brennan's eyes narrowed. That's dangerous talk. Friend, I've got my reasons, and I can pay. Samuel produced a small leather pouch, heavy with coin. Brennan glanced around nervously. Not here. Meet me at the old mine shaft, north of town, after sundown. The abandoned mine was a dark wound in the mountainside. Its entrance partially collapsed. Brennan was already there when Samuel arrived, pacing nervously. This better be worth the risk, Brennan said. Morrison's got ears everywhere. Tell me about the robbery. Brennan spat tobacco juice into the snow. Inside job. Had to be. They knew exactly which wagon, exactly when it would pass Devil's Canyon. Only Morrison and his top men knew the schedule. Who would have the nerve to rob Morrison? Could be competitors, could be someone within his own organization who got tired of waiting for their cut. Brennan paused. Or it could be Morrison himself. Samuel's eyebrows rose. Rob his own shipment? Think about it. He's in debt up to his eyeballs, creditors breathing down his neck, but he had that shipment insured for twice its value, if it gets stolen. He collects the insurance money, pays off some debts, and the goods still exist somewhere to be sold later. Can you prove it? Me? No. But there's someone who might. Clarence Headley, Morrison's bookkeeper. Nervous little fellow. Always looks like he's about to jump out of his skin. If Morrison's cooking the books, Headley would know. Samuel thanked Brennan and paid him, then made his way back to town. The pieces were falling into place. If he could get evidence of insurance fraud, it might be enough to bring Morrison down. The next morning brought disturbing news. Mrs. Dobbs, the cleaning woman, was at the inn early, her face grave. It's Mrs. Morrison, she told Pritchard in hushed tones. She's taken ill, or so Mr. Morrison says, confined to her bed, no visitors allowed. Samuel's blood ran cold. What kind of illness? That's just it. Nobody knows. Morrison won't let the doctor see her. Says she just needs rest. Mrs. Dobbs leaned closer. But I was there yesterday. Saw her trying to leave the house. Morrison caught her at the door, dragged her back inside. The sounds that came after—" She shuddered. Samuel couldn't wait any longer. That evening, he located Clarence Headley's modest house on the poor side of town. The bookkeeper answered the door himself, a thin, rabbity man with nervous eyes. "Mr. Headley, my name is Samuel Hawkins. I need to speak with you about James Morrison." Headley's face went white. "I don't know what you mean. I'm just a bookkeeper. Who's been documenting fraudulent insurance claims?" Samuel said quietly. "I know about the staged robbery, and I think you want out before Morrison decides you know too much." For a moment, Headley looked ready to slam the door. Then his shoulders sagged. "Come in, quickly." The small parlor was cramped but neat. Headley poured himself whiskey with shaking hands. "How did you know?" "Lucky guess," Samuel said. "But I need proof. Mrs. Morrison's life may depend on it." "Ah." Understanding dawned in Headley's eyes. "You're the mountain man she knew as a girl. Morrison's been ranting about you. Will you help?" Headley was quiet for a long moment. Then, "He's going to kill her, you know, just like Margaret. Maybe not right away, but eventually, when she's no longer useful, or when she defies him one too many times. Then help me stop him." "I have ledgers," Headley said finally. "2 sets, one for the authorities. One real, they show everything. The debts, the insurance policies, the payments to the men who staged the robbery. But if Morrison finds out I gave them to you, he won't. We'll be careful." Headley went to a hidden panel in the wall and extracted several leather-bound books. "Take them. I've been wanting to leave for months, but I was too scared. Maybe this is my chance." Samuel tucked the ledgers inside his coat. "Get out of town tonight. Take the late stage to Denver." "What about Mrs. Morrison?" "I'll handle that." But as Samuel left Headley's house, he saw flames rising from the direction of the Morrison home. His heart hammering. He ran through the streets, joining the bucket brigade that was already forming. The carriage house was ablaze. Horses screaming as stable hands tried to lead them out. Morrison stood in his nightshirt, shouting orders, and there, silhouetted in an upstairs window, was Elizabeth, pounding on the glass. "She's locked in!" someone shouted. Morrison made no move to help. "The door must have jammed," he said unconvincingly. "These old locks." Samuel didn't hesitate. He grabbed an axe from the fire wagon and charged into the house. The smoke was thick, but he knew the layout from his surveillance. He took the stairs 3 at a time, found Elizabeth's door locked from the outside. 2 swings of the axe splintered the lock. Elizabeth fell into his arms, coughing, her nightgown singed. "He locked me in," she gasped. "When the fire started, he locked me in. I know. Hold on." He carried her down the stairs and out into the night, where the crowd gathered. Women wrapped her in blankets while men continued fighting the fire. Morrison appeared, playing the concerned husband. "Thank God you were here. Hawkins, the lock must have jammed." "It was locked from the outside," Samuel said loudly. "I saw it." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Morrison's face darkened. "You're mistaken. The smoke, the confusion." "No mistake." Samuel met his gaze steadily. "Just like there was no mistake about your first wife's death." The accusation hung in the cold air. Morrison stepped forward, fists clenched, but the fire chief intervened. "That's enough excitement for one night. Mrs. Morrison needs medical attention." Dr. Whitman appeared, taking charge of Elizabeth. As he examined her for smoke inhalation, he found more bruises, old and new, covering her arms and ribs. His expression grew grim. "This woman has been severely mistreated," he announced. "These injuries didn't come from any fire." The crowd's murmur grew louder. Morrison tried to bluster, to deny, but the evidence was clear, and Samuel still had the ledgers hidden in his room, ready to deliver the final blow. Elizabeth looked up at him from where she sat wrapped in blankets, her eyes holding a mixture of fear and hope. The night was far from over, but for the first time since that wedding day, Samuel saw a glimmer of possibility. The fire was contained to the carriage house, but something larger was burning. Morrison's carefully constructed facade was finally crumbling. And in the ashes, perhaps Elizabeth could find her freedom. Dr. Whitman insisted on taking Elizabeth to his home, where his wife could tend to her properly. Morrison tried to object, but the crowd's hostile murmurs silenced him. Samuel watched as they led her away, her shoulders wrapped in a thick quilt, her face pale but determined. "This isn't over, Hawkins," Morrison growled, stepping close. "She's my wife. The law's on my side." "The law doesn't protect men who lock their wives in burning buildings," Samuel replied evenly. Morrison's eyes glittered dangerously. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I own this town. We'll see about that." Samuel returned to the inn and retrieved Headley's ledgers. The evidence was damning: false manifests, inflated insurance claims, payments to the men who'd staged the robbery. Morrison had been bleeding his own company dry, using the insurance money to pay off gambling debts and failed investments. The next morning, Samuel took the ledgers to Judge Carlton, the circuit judge who happened to be in town for the monthly court session. Carlton was one of the few officials Morrison couldn't buy. He lived in Denver and had a reputation for stubborn honesty. "This is serious business, Mr. Hawkins," Carlton said after reviewing the documents. "Insurance fraud, conspiracy, theft. If these ledgers are authentic, they are. Clarence Headley kept them." "He's already left town, fearing for his life." Carlton nodded slowly. "I'll issue warrants immediately. But Morrison has powerful friends. This could get ugly." It got ugly faster than anyone expected. By noon, Morrison's men were searching for Samuel, checking the inn, the stables, anywhere he might be hiding. But Samuel had anticipated this. He'd moved to an abandoned shack on the edge of town, one he'd scouted days earlier. From there, he watched Morrison's empire begin to crumble. The sheriff, forced by Judge Carlton's warrants, arrested 2 of Morrison's men who'd participated in the staged robbery. Faced with prison time, they quickly turned on their employer. But Morrison himself remained free, claiming the charges were fabricated by business rivals. And Elizabeth remained trapped in a legal limbo, safe for the moment at Dr. Whitman's house, but still Morrison's wife in the eyes of the law. That evening, Mrs. Whitman brought Samuel a message. Elizabeth wanted to see him. He found her sitting by the fire in the Whitman's parlor, looking fragile but resolute. The bruises on her face had darkened further, a testament to Morrison's brutality. "Samuel," she said softly as he entered. "Thank you. If you hadn't broken down that door." "Don't think about it," he said, taking a chair across from her. "How are you feeling?" "Sore, tired, but alive." She managed a weak smile. "Mrs. Whitman says Morrison's been by 3 times, demanding I return home. The doctor refuses to let him in." "Good, you're safe here. For now." Her expression grew troubled. "But he's right about the law. I'm his property. Eventually, I'll have to go back." "No," Samuel said firmly. "We'll find another way." "What way?" "Divorce is nearly impossible, especially for a woman. I have no money for lawyers, no grounds that a court would accept. A few bruises aren't enough. Wives endure worse every day, and the law does nothing." Samuel leaned forward. "What if Morrison goes to prison for fraud?" "Then I'm a criminal's wife, destitute and disgraced. Better than dead, I suppose, but—" She trailed off, staring into the fire. "Elizabeth, look at me." He waited until her eyes met his. "I won't let him hurt you again. Whatever it takes. You can't fight the whole world. Samuel, you're one man. I've survived worse odds." A knock interrupted them. Dr. Whitman entered, his face grave. "I'm sorry to intrude, but there's news. Morrison's posted bail, and he's gathered his men at the saloon. The talk is disturbing." "What kind of talk?" Samuel asked. "The kind that involves lynching parties and frontier justice. He's calling you a thief and a kidnapper, saying you're trying to steal his wife." Whitman paused. "I've sent word to Judge Carlton, but he's riding circuit and won't be back for days. Samuel stood. Then I'd better prepare for visitors. Samuel, no, Elizabeth said, rising despite her injuries. You can't face them all. I don't intend to. He turned to Whitman. Keep her safe. Lock the doors. Arm yourself if necessary. He left before Elizabeth could protest further. The streets were unusually quiet. Most honest folk had sensed trouble coming and retreated indoors. Samuel made his way to the telegraph office, where he sent a carefully worded message to the UND Marshal's office in Denver, detailing Morrison's crimes and the immediate threat. Then he visited the gunsmith. Expecting trouble? The smith asked, noting Samuel's purchase of ammunition and a second pistol, hoping to avoid it. Samuel replied, "But a man should be prepared." As darkness fell, Samuel positioned himself strategically, not at the shack where Morrison's men might look, but in the church bell tower, with clear sight lines to both the doctor's house and the main street. He'd learned patience in the mountains, the art of waiting for prey to reveal itself. He didn't have to wait long. Around midnight, a group of riders assembled outside the saloon. Morrison led them, his voice carrying in the still air as he worked them into a righteous fury. They were going to reclaim his stolen wife, he declared, and deal with the mountain man who'd corrupted her. But as they rode toward the doctor's house, they found the sheriff and 6 deputized townsmen waiting. Judge Carlton's warrants had given the sheriff backbone, and Dr. Whitman's testimony about Elizabeth's injuries had turned public opinion. "Turn back, Morrison," the sheriff called. "There'll be no mob justice tonight." Morrison reined in his horse. "I want my wife, Sheriff, and I want Hawkins arrested for kidnapping. Your wife is under medical care. As for Mr. Hawkins, he saved her life. No crime in that. He's filled her head with lies, turned her against me. From what I've seen, you did that yourself." The sheriff replied steadily. "Now, disperse, all of you, before someone does something they'll regret." For a tense moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Morrison wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll have satisfaction, one way or another." From his perch, Samuel watched them retreat. The immediate danger had passed. But Morrison was like a wounded bear now, more dangerous than ever. Something would have to give. The next morning brought unexpected news. A letter had arrived for Elizabeth, delivered by special courier from Philadelphia. Samuel was present when she read it, her face cycling through surprise, joy, and uncertainty. "It's from my mother's cousin, Theodore Ashford," she explained. "He's a banker in Philadelphia. He heard about Mother's death and my situation. He's offering me a position as governess to his children and passage back east." "That's wonderful," Samuel said, though his heart sank. "When?" "The stage leaves tomorrow afternoon." "He's already wired the money for passage." She looked at him, conflict clear in her eyes. "It's a chance for a new life, far from Morrison. You should take it." "Should I?" She set the letter aside. "What about you, Samuel?" "I'll be fine. I always am. That's not what I meant." She rose and crossed to where he stood by the window. "All these years, I remembered that boy who carried me home when I fell, who caught fireflies with me and promised we'd always be friends. I thought about you every summer, wondered if you remembered too." "I remembered," he said quietly. "And now we've found each other again, only to part once more." She touched his hand. "Come with me, Samuel. Leave this place. We could start over in Philadelphia." He was quiet for a long moment, imagining it. A life in the city, surrounded by people and buildings and noise, away from his mountains, his solitude, everything he'd known for 12 years. "I don't belong in places like Philadelphia," he said finally. "The wilderness is my home now." "Then I'll stay," she said impulsively. "We'll face Morrison together." "No." He turned to her, cupping her bruised face gently. "You need to go. Be safe. Morrison will never stop hunting you here. Take this chance. Elizabeth, live the life you deserve." Tears slipped down her cheeks. It's not fair. We just found each other again. Maybe that's enough, he said. To know we both survived, both remembered. Maybe that's all we were meant to have. She kissed him then, soft and desperate, tasting of tears and might-have-beens. He held her carefully, mindful of her injuries, wishing he could freeze this moment forever. But time moved forward relentlessly. That night, word came that Morrison had disappeared. His house stood empty, his office abandoned. Some said he'd fled ahead of federal marshals. Others whispered of darker possibilities. Samuel spent the night on guard, trusting nothing. Morrison wasn't the type to run. He was out there somewhere, planning something. The answer came with the dawn. A note, nailed to the doctor's door. Noon, Main Street. Come alone or she dies anyway. Morrison. A challenge. A duel. The kind of frontier justice Morrison believed in. Samuel showed the note to the sheriff, who shook his head. I can't allow this. Dueling is illegal. And if I don't show, he'll find another way, another time. At least this way. It ends today. The sheriff was silent, knowing Samuel was right. Morrison had lost everything. His business, his reputation, his wife. He had nothing left but rage and a desire for revenge. I'll be there, the sheriff said finally. To make sure it's fair. That's all I can do. Samuel spent the morning preparing. He cleaned his pistols, checked his ammunition, made peace with whatever gods listened to men like him. At 11:30, he went to see Elizabeth one last time. Don't go, she pleaded. We can leave now, together. Forget the stage, forget everything. Just run. He'll follow. You know he will. This is the only way to be truly free. She clung to him, and he breathed in the scent of her hair, memorizing it. Then he gently pulled away. If something happens, nothing will happen, she interrupted fiercely. You're going to win, and I'm going to get on that stage. And someday, when Morrison is just a bad memory, you're going to come find me in Philadelphia. He smiled sadly, kissed her forehead, and left without another word. They both knew the truth, that some canyons were too deep to cross, some wounds too old to heal. But it was a pretty dream, and he'd let her keep it. The clock tower struck noon as Samuel stepped into the street. The noon sun cast short shadows on Main Street as Samuel walked toward his destiny. The town had emptied, shutters closed, doors barred. Even the saloon sat silent, but he knew they watched from behind curtains and through cracks in the walls, the entire town holding its breath. Morrison waited in the center of the street, dressed in black like an undertaker. His face showed the ravages of the past days, unshaven, hollow-eyed, but burning with a terrible purpose. I knew you'd come, Morrison called out. Too much pride to run. This isn't about pride, Samuel replied, stopping 20 paces away. It's about ending this before anyone else gets hurt. Noble words from a thief. Morrison's hand hovered near his holster. You took everything from me. My business, my reputation, my wife. You lost those things yourself. I just held up a mirror. The sheriff stepped out from the jail, positioning himself to the side. This doesn't have to happen. Morrison, surrender now. Face the charges legally. Morrison laughed bitterly. Legal? There's no law out here but what a man makes himself. He focused on Samuel. When I'm done with you, she'll have nowhere to run. A widow has even fewer rights than a wife. Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd suspected Morrison might see Elizabeth's widowhood as an opportunity to reclaim her, twisted as that logic was. Whenever you're ready, Samuel said quietly. Time slowed. A tumbling weed rolled across the street between them. Somewhere, a dog barked. Morrison's eyes narrowed, telegraphing his intent a heartbeat before his hand moved. Both men drew simultaneously. The crack of gunfire echoed off the buildings, followed by a second shot so close it sounded like one prolonged roar. Morrison staggered, clutching his right shoulder where Samuel's bullet had struck. His gun fell from nerveless fingers, but Samuel also wavered, blood spreading across his left side where Morrison's shot had found its mark. Damn you, Morrison gasped, falling to his knees. Couldn't even kill you proper. Samuel walked forward unsteadily, keeping his gun trained on the wounded man. "It's over, Morrison. Let her go." Morrison looked up, his face twisted with pain and rage. Then, quick as a snake, his left hand went to his boot, pulling a hidden derringer. The sheriff's rifle cracked before Morrison could aim. The small gun flew from Morrison's hand as he collapsed backward into the dust. "He's alive," the sheriff announced after checking. "But he won't be using that arm again." Samuel sank to one knee, pressing his hand to his bleeding side. The world tilted strangely, and he heard running footsteps. Elizabeth's voice calling his name. "Don't," he managed as she knelt beside him. "The stage." "Forget the stage," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Dr. Whitman, someone get the doctor." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and laudanum. Samuel drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of hands working on his wound, of Elizabeth's presence like an anchor in the storm. When he finally woke fully, it was night. He lay in a clean bed in the doctor's house, bandages wrapped tight around his middle. Elizabeth sat in a chair beside him, still wearing the same dress, now stained with his blood. "You missed your stage," he said hoarsely. "There'll be another." She took his hand. "Morrison's in custody. The federal marshals arrived an hour ago. Between the shooting and the fraud charges, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison." "Good." He studied her face in the lamplight. "You're free now." "Yes." She squeezed his hand. "Free to make my own choices." Dr. Whitman entered, checking Samuel's bandages. "You're lucky. Mr. Hawkins, the bullet went clean through without hitting anything vital. You'll be sore for weeks, but you'll live." "How long before he can travel?" Elizabeth asked. "Travel?" The doctor frowned. "Not for at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. Why?" "Because we have plans to make," she said firmly. "Don't we, Samuel?" He looked at her, confused. "Elizabeth, I've been thinking," she continued. "Philadelphia was my mother's dream, not mine. I don't want to be a governess to someone else's children. I want—" She paused, gathering courage. "I want to go with you." "To the mountains?" "Elizabeth, you don't understand what that life is like. The isolation, the danger. I understand that I've spent the last week locked in a prison of propriety and law. I understand that the only time I felt truly alive was when we were running through the snow that night, free under the stars." Her voice grew stronger. "I understand that I lost you once, and I won't lose you again." "It's no life for a woman," he protested weakly. "Says who? There are women throughout these mountains, living and thriving. I can learn. Samuel, I'm stronger than I look. I know you are." He touched the bruises on her face gently. "You survived Morrison. Then give me a chance to choose my own life, not what's proper or expected, but what I want." She leaned closer. "And what I want is you." Dr. Whitman cleared his throat. "I'll give you two some privacy. But Mr. Hawkins needs rest." After he left, Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "It won't be easy," he said finally. "My cabin is small, rough, no fancy dresses or tea parties. I've had fancy dresses. They came with a price I couldn't pay." She smiled. "Besides, I seem to remember a girl who preferred climbing trees to tea parties. That was a long time ago." "Not so long." She brushed his hair back from his forehead. "Some things don't change, Samuel. We were friends once. We could be again, and maybe more." He caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." He pulled her down for a kiss, gentle and full of promise. When they parted, she was smiling through her tears. "Rest now," she said. "We have time to plan. The mountains aren't going anywhere." Over the next 2 weeks, as Samuel recovered, they made their preparations. Elizabeth sold the jewelry Morrison had given her, meaningless baubles that funded supplies for a new life. She traded her silk dresses for practical wool and leather, her delicate shoes for sturdy boots. The townspeople watched with a mixture of scandal and admiration. Here was a woman who'd survived a brutal marriage, who could have retreated to comfortable safety in the East, choosing instead the uncertain freedom of the frontier. Mrs. Whitman taught her basic medical skills, how to treat wounds, identify medicinal plants, set broken bones. The general store's wife showed her how to preserve meat, make pemmican, repair tears in heavy fabric. "You really mean to do this?" Mrs. Peabody said, watching Elizabeth practice loading a rifle under Samuel's instruction. "I do." Elizabeth sighted down the barrel, squeezed the trigger. The shot hit the target dead center. "I wasted too many years being what others expected. It's time to be myself." The day Samuel was cleared to travel, they stood together outside the church where it had all begun. The building looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, less imposing. "Any regrets?" Samuel asked. "Only that it took us so long to find each other again." She adjusted the pack on her shoulders. She'd insisted on carrying her own supplies. "I'm ready." They rode out of Pine Ridge as the sun crested the mountains, painting the peaks gold and rose. Buck carried Samuel, while Elizabeth rode a sturdy mare she'd named Liberty. Fitting, Samuel thought. The town fell away behind them, and the wilderness opened before them like a promise. There would be challenges ahead, harsh winters, dangerous wildlife, the 1,000 difficulties of frontier life. But there would also be freedom, honest work, and the chance to build something together. "Samuel," Elizabeth called as they entered the tree line. "Yes? Remember what I said when I was 8, about marrying someone brave?" He smiled. "That was silly talk. You said—" "No," she said, urging Liberty alongside Buck. "I was right the first time." They rode on into the mountains, into their new life, leaving the past behind like smoke on the wind. Somewhere above them, an eagle cried out in welcome, and Samuel felt something ease in his chest that had been tight for 20 years. He was no longer hiding in the wilderness. He was coming home, and bringing with him the one person who made that home complete. The sun climbed higher, warming their faces despite the snow, and the mountains embraced them like old friends welcoming travelers from a long, difficult journey. The crack of gunfire shattered the mountain silence. Samuel dove behind a fallen log, pulling Elizabeth down with him as bark exploded where their heads had been. Morrison's men had found them. "Stay down," Samuel hissed, checking his rifle. They were 2 days out from Pine Ridge, following a narrow trail through dense pine forest. He'd been careless, letting his guard down too soon. Another shot rang out. Then Morrison's voice, hoarse but unmistakable. "Did you think prison walls could hold me? Hawkins, I've got friends in high places." Samuel cursed under his breath. Morrison must have escaped during transport, probably bribed the guards. Now he was here with at least 3 men, judging by the gunfire positions. "Let the woman go, Morrison," Samuel called out. "This is between us. She made her choice." Morrison snarled back. "She dies with you." Elizabeth pressed close to Samuel, her new rifle ready, despite the terror she must be feeling. Her hands were steady. "How many?" 4, maybe 5. They've got us pinned." Samuel studied their position. The trail ahead curved around a steep cliff face. Behind them, the path they'd traveled was exposed. But to their left, a jumble of massive boulders offered potential cover. "When I start shooting, run for those rocks," he whispered. "Don't stop, no matter what. We go together or not at all," she said firmly. There wasn't time to argue. Samuel rose slightly, fired 3 quick shots to make Morrison's men duck, then grabbed Elizabeth's hand. "Now!" They sprinted for the boulders as gunfire erupted behind them. Samuel felt a bullet tug at his coat. Elizabeth cried out, stumbling, but kept running. They dove behind the largest boulder just as shots chipped stone where they'd been. "Are you hit?" Samuel examined her frantically. "Just grazed my arm." She showed him a tear in her sleeve, blood seeping through. "I'm fine," but they were far from fine. Morrison's men were spreading out, trying to flank them. Their horses had bolted at the first gunshot, taking most of their supplies. Samuel had his rifle, pistol, and whatever ammunition he carried. Elizabeth had her rifle and the knife he'd taught her to use. "Surrender, and I'll make it quick," Morrison called. Keep fighting, and I'll make you watch her die slow." Samuel's jaw clenched. He knew Morrison meant every word. The man's twisted desire for Elizabeth had turned to murderous rage when she chose freedom over him. "Samuel," Elizabeth whispered, "there's a gap between these rocks. I can see daylight." He looked where she pointed. A narrow passage led through the boulder field, barely wide enough for a person. It might lead to safety or trap them completely. A shot spanged off the rock near Samuel's head. Morrison's men were getting closer, using cover to advance. Soon they'd have clear shots. "Go," Samuel decided. "I'll hold them off." "No." Elizabeth's green eyes flashed with determination. "We survive together or not at all. Remember?" Before he could protest, she was moving through the gap. Samuel had no choice but to follow, backing through while watching for pursuit. The passage twisted between massive stones, sometimes so narrow they had to turn sideways. They emerged on a steep hillside covered in loose shale. Above them, the mountain rose in jagged cliffs. Below, a rushing river carved through a deep gorge. And behind them, shouts indicated Morrison's men had found the passage. "The river," Elizabeth said. "If we can reach it." A bullet whined past, answered by Samuel's return fire. They half ran, half slid down the treacherous slope, stones cascading around them. Elizabeth lost her footing, sliding 20 feet before catching herself on a scraggly pine. Morrison appeared at the passage exit, his wounded arm in a sling but a pistol in his good hand. His face was twisted with insane fury. "You should have let her burn. Hawkins!" He fired, the bullet striking sparks from the rocks near Elizabeth. Samuel's rifle cracked in response, but Morrison ducked back. More men emerged, firing down at them. They reached a cliff above the river, a 20-foot drop to dark, rushing water. Samuel could hear the roar of rapids downstream. "Can you swim?" he asked Elizabeth. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri," she said with dark humor. "What do you think? Then hold your breath and pray." He grabbed her hand. On 3, 1, 2, Morrison's men burst from cover, firing. Samuel felt a burning pain across his ribs as he and Elizabeth leaped into space. The water hit like a frozen hammer, driving all breath from their bodies. The current seized them immediately, spinning them downstream. Samuel struggled to keep hold of Elizabeth, to keep both their heads above water. Rocks loomed out of the foam. Samuel twisted, taking the impact on his back, protecting Elizabeth. Stars exploded across his vision. Then they were past, swept around a bend that hid them from Morrison's view. They fought the current for what seemed like hours, but was probably minutes, finally dragging themselves onto a rocky beach in a calm eddy. They lay gasping like landed fish, coughing up river water. Are you all right?" Samuel managed. Elizabeth pushed herself up on her elbows, hair streaming water, clothes torn and clinging. "Define all right," she said weakly. "Despite everything." Samuel found himself laughing. The absurdity of it all, pursued by a madman, shot at, nearly drowned, and she still had her dry humor. Elizabeth looked at him like he'd lost his mind, then started laughing too, partly hysteria, partly relief. "We need to move," Samuel said finally, sobering. "Morrison won't give up. He'll follow the river." They wrung out what they could, checked their weapons. Miraculously, Samuel's pistol had stayed in its holster. His rifle was gone, lost to the river. Elizabeth had managed to keep her knife. Samuel's ribs burned where the bullet had grazed him, and Elizabeth's arm was still bleeding. They tore strips from her underskirt to bind their wounds, then began working their way downstream along the bank. The sun was setting when they found the cave, a shallow shelter carved by ancient waters, hidden behind a screen of willows. They crawled inside, exhausted beyond measure. "No fire," Samuel said regretfully. "The smoke would give us away." "I'm too tired to care," Elizabeth said, curling against him for warmth. Despite their soaked clothes and the dropping temperature, her presence was comforting. "I'm sorry," Samuel said into the darkness. "I should have expected this, should have been ready." "Stop," she placed a finger on his lips. "Morrison's choices aren't your fault, or mine. He's a rabid animal that needs to be put down. Tomorrow, we'll circle back to the trail, find our horses if we can. Get to Fort Collins, alert the authorities. Tomorrow, she agreed. Then, softer. Samuel, despite everything, being shot at, nearly drowning. I'm not sorry. This is still better than the life I left. He pulled her closer, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. You're insane. You know that? Probably. But I'm free. She tilted her head up, finding his lips in the darkness. They kissed with desperate passion, aware of how close death had come, how uncertain tomorrow was. When they parted, Samuel felt something fundamental shift inside him. This wasn't just about protecting Elizabeth anymore, or honoring a childhood connection. This was about a future, a life together. If they could survive to claim it. A sound outside made them freeze, footsteps on gravel, careful but audible. Samuel eased his pistol free, pushing Elizabeth deeper into the cave behind him. I know you're in there, Morrison's voice carried on the night air. Saw your tracks. Just me now. Sent my boys around to cut off your escape. But I wanted to finish this personal. Samuel weighed their options. The cave had only one entrance. Morrison had chosen his approach well. Let her go. Samuel tried one more time. Take me, but let her go. She had her chance to be a respectable widow. Morrison said, could have mourned you properly. Found another husband. Instead, she chose to run off like a savage. She's as guilty as you now. Elizabeth's hand found Samuel's in the darkness. Squeezing tight, he squeezed back. A silent promise. Whatever happened, they'd face it together. You want us? Samuel called out. Come and get us. Morrison's laugh was ugly. Oh, I will. But first, I think I'll enjoy the anticipation. You can sit in there all night, wondering when I'll strike. Maybe I'll wait for dawn, when you're stiff with cold. Maybe I'll smoke you out, or maybe... His voice grew closer. Maybe I'll just... The sound of a rifle shot cut him off, followed by a heavy thud. Samuel waited, every muscle tense. Then a familiar voice called out, It's Tom Brennan. Morrison's down. You folks all right in there? Samuel emerged cautiously to find the former cavalry scout standing over Morrison's still form, rifle in hand. 3 other men from Pine Ridge spread out behind him. Tom? How did you... Dr. Whitman sent word when Morrison escaped. We've been tracking you for 2 days. Lost you at the river, but heard the gunshot just now. Brennan judged Morrison with his boot. He's done. Clean shot through the heart. Elizabeth emerged from the cave, swaying with exhaustion. His men, captured an hour ago. They were circling back when we caught them. Brennan grinned. Turns out the whole town's been worried about you two. Even pooled together a reward for bringing Morrison in, dead or alive. Keep it, Samuel said. We just want to go home. Home? Brennan looked between them. You mean the mountains? Elizabeth stepped forward, taking Samuel's arm. Despite everything, her torn clothes, tangled hair, the blood and dirt, she held herself with quiet dignity. Yes, she said simply. Home. News of Morrison's death spread through the Colorado Territory like wildfire. The man who had terrorized Pine Ridge, who had built his empire on fear and brutality, was gone. His victims began to speak. Freight drivers he'd cheated, competitors he'd ruined, women who'd suffered in silence. The federal marshals found evidence of more crimes than anyone had imagined. Samuel and Elizabeth returned to Pine Ridge briefly to settle affairs. The town that had once whispered behind closed doors now openly embraced them. Judge Carlton himself presided over a hearing that cleared them of any wrongdoing in Morrison's death. Self-defense, clear as day. The judge declared, Mr. Hawkins and Mrs. Morrison, Miss Turner were fleeing for their lives from an escaped criminal. Case closed. Elizabeth had legally reclaimed her maiden name, shedding the last vestiges of her brief, terrible marriage. She stood in the courtroom wearing her new frontier clothes, her healing arm in a sling but her head held high. Afterward, they visited the cemetery where her mother lay. Elizabeth knelt by the simple headstone, placing wildflowers she'd gathered. She would be scandalized, Elizabeth said softly. Her daughter choosing the wilderness over civilization, living unmarried with a mountain man. Do you care? Samuel asked gently. No. She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. Mother lived her whole life by society's rules, and where did it lead? A desperate flight from debt, years of genteel poverty, and finally dying alone in a boarding house. I choose differently. They spent one more night at the Whitman house, where the doctor's wife had prepared a farewell dinner. Half the town seemed to drop by to wish them well, bringing gifts, ammunition, preserved food, warm blankets, practical things for their mountain life. You've given us hope, Mrs. Peabody said, pressing a wrapped package into Elizabeth's hands. Shown that a woman can choose her own path. Inside was a beautiful quilt, handmade with scenes of mountains and stars. Elizabeth's eyes misted. Thank you, for everything. Tom Brennan arrived leading their recovered horses, plus a sturdy pack mule. Figured you could use the extra carrying capacity. The boys took up a collection. There's supplies in those packs to see you through till spring. Samuel was overwhelmed by the generosity. He'd lived isolated for so long, he'd forgotten the warmth of community. We can't accept all this. You can and you will. Dr. Whitman interrupted. You saved Pine Ridge from Morrison. This is our thanks. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, perfect for traveling. Samuel and Elizabeth mounted their horses, the pack mule tied behind. The whole town gathered to see them off, waving and calling good wishes. As they rode out, Elizabeth looked back once at the church where it had all begun. Then she faced forward, toward the mountains, rising blue and eternal against the sky. No regrets? Samuel asked, echoing his question from before. None, she said firmly. Let's go home. The journey to Samuel's cabin took 3 days through increasingly wild country. Elizabeth proved herself hardy, never complaining about the difficult trails or cold nights. She learned to read the weather signs, to move quietly through the forest, to help make camp with efficient grace. On the third afternoon, they crested a ridge and Samuel pointed ahead. There, home. The cabin sat in a meadow beside a crystal-clear stream, backed by towering peaks. It was small but solidly built, with a stone chimney and sturdy log walls. Smoke rose from the chimney. Samuel had asked a trapper friend to look after the place. It's perfect, Elizabeth breathed. Old Pete emerged as they approached, his weathered face splitting in a grin. About time you got back, Sam, and with company too. He tipped his hat to Elizabeth. Ma'am, Pete Garrison at your service. Thank you for tending the place, Samuel said, dismounting. No trouble. Got a nice elk hanging in the smokehouse. Figured you'd need meat. I'll be heading out now. Leave you folks to settle in. Pete winked at Elizabeth. You need anything, ma'am? My cabin's 2 valleys over. Sam knows the way. After Pete left, Samuel showed Elizabeth around. The cabin had one main room with a fireplace, a small bedroom, and a lean-to for storage. It was sparse but clean, with handmade furniture and pelts for warmth. I know it's not much, Samuel began, but Elizabeth cut him off with a kiss. It's freedom, she said. It's peace. It's ours. That makes it everything. They spent the rest of the day unpacking, arranging their new life. Elizabeth hung her quilt on the wall, adding color to the rustic space. She organized the supplies with an efficiency that impressed Samuel, creating a proper home from his bachelor quarters. That night, they sat by the fire, planning for the future. There was much to do before winter set in, fully hunting to be done, wood to be cut, the cabin to be reinforced. Elizabeth would need warm clothes, and Samuel wanted to add a room before next year. I'll teach you everything, he promised. Tracking, hunting, which plants are safe to eat, how to read the weather, handle the animals. It's hard living, but it's living, Elizabeth finished. Not just existing within someone else's rules, actually living. She nestled against him. I want to learn it all. Over the following weeks, she proved as good as her word. She learned to shoot with deadly accuracy, to move through the forest like a shadow, She could dress a deer, prepare hides, identify edible plants. The soft city woman transformed into a capable frontier partner. But more than that, she brought warmth to Samuel's isolated existence. The cabin filled with her laughter, her singing as she worked. She told stories by the fire, read from the few books they had, created civilization in the wilderness without trying to tame it. One evening, as the first heavy snow began to fall, they stood together watching the flakes dance in the fading light. "Winter's here," Samuel said. "Once the passes close, we'll be cut off till spring. Last chance to change your mind." Elizabeth turned in his arms. "Samuel Hawkins, when will you understand? I'm exactly where I want to be, where I choose to be. Even though we're not married? Even though people would call this improper? Let them talk. We know the truth. That what we have is more honest than any forced marriage could be. We're partners by choice, not law." She smiled. "Though if you wanted to make it official, I wouldn't object, but only if you want to, not because society demands it." Samuel was quiet for a moment, then went to his storage chest. He pulled out a small leather pouch and returned to her. "I've been waiting for the right moment," he said, opening the pouch to reveal 2 simple gold bands. "Bought these in Pine Ridge before we left. Pete's not just a trapper. He's also an ordained minister from his army days. If you're willing." Elizabeth's eyes shimmered with tears. "Yes, oh, yes." 3 days later, with snow falling thick outside, Pete Garrison performed a simple ceremony in their cabin. Tom Brennan had made the journey to stand as witness, bringing his wife Martha, who had insisted on coming despite the weather. Elizabeth wore her best wool dress with wildflowers in her hair. Samuel had trimmed his beard and donned his cleanest shirt. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, chosen freely, entered willingly. "Do you, Samuel, take this woman as your wife, to stand beside you through whatever trials these mountains bring?" "I do." "And do you, Elizabeth, take this man as your husband, to build a life with him in this wilderness?" "I do." "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado and the Almighty above, I pronounce you husband and wife." They kissed as their friends cheered, and Martha produced a cake she'd somehow managed to transport through the snow. They celebrated into the night, sharing stories and dreams while the storm wrapped the cabin in a cocoon of white. When the guests finally departed, promising to visit come spring, Samuel and Elizabeth stood together in their doorway, watching the snow fall on their kingdom of peaks and pines. "No more running," Samuel said softly. "No more hiding, just living." "Together," Elizabeth added, threading her fingers through his. "The way it should have been from the start. Maybe it happened exactly as it needed to." Samuel reflected. "We both had to grow, to become who we are now. That boy and girl in Missouri might not have been ready for this. But we are now." Elizabeth leaned into him. "And we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." Inside the cabin, the fire crackled warmly. Outside, the vast wilderness stretched endlessly under its blanket of snow. And in between, 2 souls who had traveled long, difficult roads to find each other again created their own world, one built on choice, courage, and the kind of love that could survive anything. The mountains stood witness to their joy, ancient and enduring, promising that some things, like true love and freedom, were worth any price to claim. In the years to come, other settlers would speak of the Hawkins place with admiration and a touch of envy. Not for their material wealth, which was modest, but for the obvious happiness that radiated from their simple cabin, the partnership that made them stronger together than apart. They had children eventually, strong mountain children who grew up free and fearless. They weathered storms and droughts, lean times and plenty. They grew old together in their meadow, never regretting the choice made in extremity that became the foundation of a lifetime's joy. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Elizabeth would look at Samuel and say, "Do you recognize me, Mountain Man? I was your childhood neighbor." He would smile and reply, "I recognize you. You're my heart, my home, my forever." The wilderness had brought them together, tested them, and finally blessed them with a love as enduring as the mountains themselves. Wild, free, and absolutely true. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you tuning in from today? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share what touched your heart about Samuel and Elizabeth's journey. Your comments and experiences make our storytelling community special.